Welcome to Hope Stories. Imagine building an empire so vast that your name gleams across skyscrapers, only to have it ripped away by the one person you trusted most, your own blood. Betrayal isn't always a stranger in the shadows. Sometimes it's family smiling at you before they push you under. Tonight's story takes you into the chilling waters of survival, where power collapses in an instant, and the only hand reaching out belongs to someone the world has forgotten. A child with nothing but honesty in his eyes. What happens when innocence collides with corruption, when loyalty is found in the most unlikely place, and when the truth itself becomes more dangerous than lies? Stay with us, because the choices made in this story will test the limits of trust, sacrifice, and redemption, and they may leave you questioning what you would do if everything you built vanished in a single night. Now, step with me into the story. The water in the canal cut through Richard Coleman's body like glass shards. The shock of it wasn't just cold, it was humiliating. A man whose name crowned skyscrapers in Manhattan, who had spent decades turning Coleman Foods into an empire, was now thrashing in black water, powerless, discarded like refuse. The shove had come not from an enemy across the boardroom table, but from his own brother. Brian's eyes, once playful, once grateful, had held no hesitation. Only calculation, as Richard felt the pavement vanish under his shoes. Betrayal had a taste, he realized. Iron on his tongue, river sludge in his lungs. When he clawed his way onto the cracked embankment beneath a dying streetlight, he understood that everything he had built could be gone by dawn. He lay against the cold wall, his chest heaving, ribs screaming. He could already see how Brian's plan would unfold. Forged documents bearing Richard's signature, thugs planted in Coleman Foods corridors, money bleeding into shadow accounts. Manhattan's skyline glittered above, mocking him. His empire had been gutted from within, and he had been pushed into silence. What Brian had not calculated was the timing of fate, that a boy would appear where no one should have. Tyler was wiry, his frame thinned by years of scavenging. He was 10, but carried himself with the gravity of someone twice that age. Sneakers split at the seams, jeans torn at the knees, his small hands clutched a plastic sack already half full of cans. He froze when his eyes caught the suited man collapsed against the stone. Fear widened his gaze, then narrowed into suspicion. This was the kind of scene that usually meant trouble, the kind his mother always warned him to avoid. But then came the sound, low, guttural, almost broken. Richard whispering, "Help!" Tyler should have run. The night was thick with danger, and men like the one before him belonged to worlds far away from the trailer park in Brooklyn where he lived. Yet something in Richard's trembling hand, something in the sheer desperation, kept the boy rooted. He pulled from his pocket a half-empty bottle of water, one he had been saving for hours. His hand shook as he held it out. Richard drank, coughing, and for the first time in years tasted not victory, not wealth, but mercy. That act, small and pure, cracked open a truth he had buried under steel and profit. There were still people in this city who gave without asking. The boy's silence stretched, broken only by the hum of traffic. "What happened to you?" Tyler finally asked, voice low, cautious. Richard could have lied. He could have spun a story about muggers or accidents. Instead, exhaustion loosened his tongue. "My brother tried to kill me," he rasped. Tyler's eyes widened, his young mind racing to process words that sounded like the beginning of a crime show he had no business starring in. Richard should have felt shame asking a child for help. Yet when Tyler said, almost defiantly, "If you're telling the truth, you need a place to hide," relief surged through his battered body. The boy led him through alleys littered with broken glass, past graffiti-smeared walls and the faint smell of gasoline, into a derelict house in the Bronx. Windows boarded, floorboards sagging, the place looked like it would collapse in a strong wind. But for Richard, it was a palace compared to the canal. Tyler returned minutes later with a baseball cap that smelled of grease, an old Navy shirt 2 sizes too big. Richard pulled them on, staring at his reflection in a shard of cracked mirror. No longer the CEO of Coleman Foods. Just a man. Just a ghost. Strangely, invisibility felt like freedom. For the first time in years, the weight of polished shoes and tailored suits was gone. But with that came a deeper weight, the knowledge that his survival depended on a boy with nothing to his name. Richard's pulse quickened as he thought of the black leather bag he had hidden. Documents, cash, proof that could strip Brian bare. Without it, there was no chance of reclaiming his life. With it, he might drag others into peril. He explained in fragments, testing whether Tyler could carry such a secret. The boy listened intently, jaw set as if the burden were already his. That night, thunder rolled over the Bronx. Rain leaked through the roof in crooked lines. Richard couldn't sleep, shifting on the cold floor, while Tyler crouched by the door, wide awake, eyes scanning as if expecting intruders. At some point, footsteps echoed outside, faint but deliberate. Richard's body tensed, his mind already imagining Brian's men. The door creaked open. Tyler stepped in, wet hair plastered to his forehead, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a lanky teenager in a torn hoodie, eyes sharp, restless. "This is Marcus," Tyler said quickly. "My brother. He knows." Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. Another witness, another life at risk. Marcus looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on the bruises, the blood-stained shirt. "Tyler says you're going to take down someone powerful," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "If that's true, you need more than one kid. You need me." Richard felt the folder of secrets burning in his memory, the weight of everything he had lost pressing harder. He wanted to refuse, to send both boys away, to claw his way back to power alone. But as Marcus spoke, Richard saw something reflected in those young eyes, a hunger for justice, or maybe simply a chance to matter. It was reckless, dangerous, insane. And yet, in the hollow of that abandoned house, Richard realized the cruelest twist of all. His fate, and perhaps his redemption, now rested in the hands of two children the world had already written off. Would you trust children with secrets that could topple an empire? What would you risk if the only lifelines you had were two boys society had forgotten? As lightning split the sky above the Bronx, Richard knew the betrayal of blood was only the beginning. The true war was deciding how far he was willing to go, and how many innocents he was willing to sacrifice to survive. Rain hammered against the broken roof as Richard sat hunched in the corner of the abandoned house, his bruised ribs aching with every breath. The presence of Marcus changed the air. Tyler had been cautious but hopeful, his innocence still intact, while Marcus carried a different weight. Restless anger and the hardened edges of someone who had already seen too much. Richard studied him in the flicker of lightning through boarded windows. The teenager's jaw was tight, his fists clenched, as if he had been waiting his whole life for a fight worthy of his rage. Marcus wasted no time. "You've got proof, right? Real evidence that can bury him? If that's true, then we stop talking and start moving." The boy's urgency pressed on Richard like a blade. He wanted to admire the courage, but what struck him instead was the recklessness. Did they understand what it meant to go to war with men who killed without hesitation? He leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "This isn't a game. My brother will send men who won't think twice about silencing anyone near me. If you stay, you're in the crossfire." Tyler, sitting beside his brother, broke in quietly. "We're already in it." His small hands gripped the hem of his shirt as if anchoring himself to the truth. Richard's chest tightened. For years he had seen people as assets or liabilities, numbers on a balance sheet, but now he faced two boys who refused to be either. They had nothing, yet they offered everything. A part of him wanted to believe this was fate, that salvation had been placed in the most unlikely of hands. Another part recoiled at the morality of it. Was he turning children into pawns in his war for survival? He remembered the weight of Marina's hand years ago, his wife's voice urging him to fight fair, to build with integrity. She was gone, and he wondered if her ghost would despise what he was doing now. Lightning cracked again, and for a moment Richard thought he saw her reflection in the shard of glass propped against the wall, disappointment etched into the shadows. He turned away quickly, focusing instead on the leather bag Tyler had retrieved earlier. Inside were contracts, banking records, and the diamond earrings that had belonged to Marina. Proof, love, and memory bound together in one fragile bundle. He felt the temptation burn. With this, he could clear his name, reclaim his throne. But the agents in Union Square had hinted at another reality. Brian had poisoned the evidence, leaving trails that could implicate Richard himself. The thought clawed at him. If the world saw him as guilty, would these boys ever forgive him for dragging them into ruin? Marcus crouched across from him, eyes darting to the bag. What's inside that's so important you'd rather risk us than let it go? His voice cracked with both defiance and curiosity. Richard hesitated. Admitting the truth out loud would make it real. Yet as Tyler's gaze lifted, wide and steady, Richard felt cornered not by thugs, but by innocence. He opened the bag, laying out the documents in the dim light. These are the keys to everything. Contracts Brian forged. Transfers he engineered. But here's the twist. They've been tampered with. To an investigator, I look as guilty as him. Silence smothered the room. Tyler blinked rapidly, as if trying to absorb the complexity. Marcus, however, exploded. So, you're telling us we're risking our lives for nothing? That even if we hand this over, they'll drag you down too? Richard's reply was quiet, almost ashamed. I don't know. Maybe. But it's all I have. The teenager's fury flared. Then burn it. Walk away. Why should we believe you're not just another rich man who built an empire on lies? Maybe Brian isn't the only villain in this story. The accusation hit Richard harder than any shove into the canal. He felt his throat tighten, the familiar surge of pride demanding he defend himself. Yet instead of anger, sorrow washed over him. Wasn't this exactly what the world would think? That he deserved this fall, that no one rises so high without dirtying their hands? Tyler's voice cut through the tension, trembling but resolute. I don't think he's lying. The boy's small frame looked fragile against the shadow of his brother, but his conviction was unshakable. When I found him, he wasn't fighting like a guilty man. He was fighting like someone who wanted to live. His words twisted a knife in Richard's chest. To be believed by a child when grown men would dismiss him, that was both salvation and damnation. The storm outside seemed to echo the war inside the room. Richard looked at both brothers and saw the impossible choice looming. Trust them with the truth and risk shaping them into soldiers of his battle, or push them away and face his demons alone. Either way, someone would bleed. If you were in Richard's place, would you risk dragging innocent lives deeper into your war for justice, or sacrifice your last chance at redemption to protect them? As thunder shook the house and the brothers' eyes burned into him, Richard realized that the true danger wasn't outside the door. It was the decision he had to make before morning broke. The storm eased into a gray morning, but inside the abandoned house the tension sharpened like glass. Richard hadn't closed his eyes all night. He had paced across the cracked floorboards until his body gave out, then sat against the wall, clutching the bag as if it were a lifeline. Tyler and Marcus slept lightly, their breaths uneven, their bodies curled close against the cold. He looked at them and felt the paradox gnawing at him. They had given him a reason to keep fighting, but they had also become the chains binding his conscience. By mid-morning, Richard forced himself outside. The Bronx streets were slick, the smell of damp asphalt thick in the air. He moved like a shadow, cap low, jacket collar high. His plan was to call Rosa from a payphone to confirm if she still had the second set of files she once hinted at. But as he reached the corner store where the payphone stood, something froze him. A black SUV idled across the street. The windows were tinted, but Richard recognized the shape of the man leaning against the hood, a bulky silhouette with the stiff posture of a hired gun. His pulse pounded. Brian's net had stretched this far already. He turned quickly, retracing his steps, his lungs burning. When he returned to the house, Marcus was awake, scanning the street from a gap in the boards. They're watching, aren't they? The teenager asked, without looking away. Richard didn't answer, but his silence was louder than denial. Tyler sat up, rubbing his eyes, his small voice breaking the stillness. So what do we do now? Richard wanted to say, we run. But the truth was heavier. Running meant abandoning proof, abandoning the fight. It meant conceding that Brian had won. Richard gathered them in the corner, lowering his voice. Brian has people close. If they find this place, it's over. We need to move, but not without a plan. Marcus's jaw tightened. Then we fight. I'm not hiding like some rat. Richard snapped sharper than intended, the pain of exhaustion cutting through his words. You're a kid, Marcus. Both of you. This isn't your war. Marcus shot back, his eyes burning with a bitterness Richard recognized in himself at that age. You think we haven't been fighting our whole lives? You had glass towers and lawyers. We had hunger and streets that didn't forgive mistakes. Don't tell me what war is. The words hit Richard like a blow. He had always believed survival was a skill forged in boardrooms and deals, but the boy's defiance stripped him bare. These children weren't stepping into his war. He had stepped into theirs. For the first time, he questioned if he had any right to involve them, or if he was simply exploiting their resilience because no one else would stand beside him. Tyler interrupted softly, his tone not angry, but heavy with quiet clarity. You don't have to fight alone anymore. The boy reached for the bag, his small hand resting on the worn leather. But you need to decide what you're really fighting for. Is it your company or something else? Richard's throat tightened. He thought of Marina, of the nights he had chosen contracts over her laughter, meetings over dinners. What had Coleman Foods really been to him? Security, power, validation, but not love. The realization cut deeper than any betrayal Brian could deliver. Before he could respond, Marcus pulled a folded sheet of paper from his hoodie pocket. I followed one of Brian's men yesterday, he admitted, his voice unsteady but determined. They were near Union Square. I overheard something. There's a meeting tomorrow night. Brian will be there. If we get close, we can hear everything, maybe even catch him with the evidence. Richard's blood ran cold. The recklessness terrified him, but the lead was undeniable. If true, this was the first thread that could unravel Brian's scheme. He studied Marcus, torn between gratitude and dread. The boy had taken risks without telling him. Trust was no longer a choice. It was forced upon him. He could drag them deeper into danger or cut them off now and lose the only allies fate had offered. Either way, guilt would consume him. That night, as the three of them sat in silence, rain dripping through the ceiling, Richard stared at the documents spread across the floor. His empire, his legacy, his wife's memory, all entwined with the lives of two boys who should have been nowhere near this battlefield. He whispered to himself, almost a confession. If I fight, I might destroy them. If I walk away, I destroy myself. Do you believe Richard should risk bringing the brothers into a direct confrontation with Brian or sacrifice his one chance at justice to keep them safe? As the shadows deepened in the ruined house, Richard realized tomorrow's meeting at Union Square would not only decide his fate, it might also decide whether the innocence of two boys would survive the war he had brought into their lives. The night before the Union Square meeting pressed down on Richard like a storm that refused to break. The abandoned house was cloaked in silence, but inside his chest the noise was deafening. Tyler and Marcus sat opposite him, their faces lit faintly by the glow of a stolen flashlight. The documents spread across the floor like a map of sins. The boys looked at him not with fear, but with expectation, as if he held the power to define not only his future but theirs. That expectation carved deeper into him than Brian's betrayal ever had. Richard had always thrived on pressure, quarterly earnings, boardroom battles, acquisitions that made or broke reputations. But this was different. Back then, failure meant he lost. Now, it meant lives ruined. He looked at Tyler. The boy's small hands curled protectively around the leather bag, and Marcus, his jaw set like a soldier ready for war. They had staked their fragile trust on him. But the thought clawing at Richard's gut was merciless. What if he failed them the way he had failed Marina? What if, by trying to fight, he led them to their deaths? The silence broke when Marcus spoke, his voice sharp with a courage that didn't quite mask the tremor beneath. We can't just watch from the sidelines. If Brian's there tomorrow, we have to act. Waiting means losing. Richard wanted to argue, to demand obedience, but the teenager's conviction was undeniable. And then Tyler added quietly, if we do nothing, you'll never get your life back, and we'll never know if we could have made a difference. The words, simple and honest, cut him open. How could a child barely old enough to understand the weight of betrayal already grasp what so many men in suits never had? That inaction could be the cruelest failure of all. Richard's breath came heavy. He wanted to shield them, to say no, to lock the door and face Brian alone. But when he looked at Marcus's fire and Tyler's unwavering eyes, he saw what he had been blind to. They weren't asking permission. They had already chosen their side. It wasn't his right to deny them, not after everything they had risked. Still, guilt gnawed at him. whispering that he was corrupting them, dragging their innocence into a war between brothers that was never theirs to fight. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps on the rotted wood, deliberate enough to freeze the air. Richard's hand shot to the nearest weapon he could find, a rusted pipe by the wall. Marcus motioned for Tyler to stay back. Richard opened the door with his breath held tight. On the other side stood Rosa, soaked to the bone, eyes darting over her shoulder. She slipped inside, shutting the door fast. "They know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Brian's people are tightening the circle, but that's not the worst of it." She reached into her coat and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photocopies of transfers, contracts, signatures, his signatures. Richard's knees weakened. Every page screamed the same story, that he had authorized the theft, the laundering, the betrayals. Rosa's hands trembled as she said, "The feds aren't just after Brian. They think you're complicit. If this goes public tomorrow, you won't be the hero who exposes him. You'll be the partner who enabled him." The room spun. Tyler's face drained of color. Marcus swore under his breath, fists tightening at his sides. Richard stared at the pages, the handwriting so familiar it felt like looking at his own guilt etched in ink. He wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that Brian had orchestrated it all, but a new dread seeped in. What if no one believed him? What if this was the legacy Marina's memory would be tied to, the man who destroyed himself and dragged children down with him? For the first time since the canal, Richard felt the true depth of his fall. Saving his company had always been the mission, but now the line blurred. Was it worth saving if it meant damning his name forever? And if he tried to clear himself, would Tyler and Marcus live long enough to see the outcome? The papers mocked him with their silence, daring him to choose between justice and survival, truth and protection. If you were Richard, would you risk exposing the evidence knowing it could condemn you, or would you bury it to shield the boys from a future built on your disgrace? As the storm winds rattled the boards on the windows, Richard knew the meeting at Union Square would no longer just decide who controlled Coleman Foods. It would decide whether the truth itself was worth dying for. Richard stared at the forged signatures until the letters blurred, the weight of his brother's trap crushing him with merciless precision. Each page was a coffin nail, hammering down the image of a man complicit in his own ruin. Rosa's trembling hands did little to soften the truth. If the evidence reached the authorities, it wouldn't just be Brian in handcuffs, it would be him. His throat tightened, his pulse loud in his ears. For years, Richard had thought betrayal was something inflicted from the outside. Now he realized the cruelest betrayal might be the one the world believed he had authored himself. Marcus slammed a fist against the wall, the hollow wood rattling. "So what? We've been risking everything for nothing? You're telling us that even if we get this to the feds, they'll think you're guilty too?" Tyler's voice was quieter, almost breaking. "Is it true? Did you sign those papers?" The question, spoken without accusation, struck harder than Marcus's anger. Richard wanted to shout, "No, God, no!" But the silence stretched too long, and in that silence Tyler's wide, innocent eyes flickered with something that tore Richard open. Doubt. He forced himself to speak, his voice raw. "I didn't. Brian forged them, but the documents are too perfect. The ink, the timestamps, the accounts. They'll believe him because he planned it that way." He dragged a hand over his face, shame pressing like a physical weight. "If I push this forward, I might take him down, but I'll go down with him." Rosa lowered her gaze. "Then you have a choice. Expose everything and risk your name, or bury it and let him win." Richard felt trapped in a cage with bars made of his own past. Every ruthless decision he had made in the boardroom, every corner cut for profit, every time he had chosen the company over Marina, they all came roaring back, painting him as the man the papers claimed him to be. He wasn't just fighting Brian anymore. He was fighting the version of himself the world had always suspected lurked beneath the polished smile. The silence was shattered by Marcus. "Then fight anyway. If you go down, at least you go down swinging. At least you show the world he's not untouchable." His words were fierce, but beneath them was something rawer, longing. Richard looked at him and saw not just defiance, but a desperate need for justice in a life that had offered none. Tyler, though, shook his head. But what if it destroys him? What if we lose him too? His small voice carried a weight disproportionate to his size, and Richard's heart broke at the impossible divide between the brothers, one demanding a battle, the other begging for protection. Richard's chest ached with the truth he didn't want to face. He was no longer deciding for himself. Every move now carved into the lives of these boys who had saved him, who had given him a second chance at humanity. He whispered to no one and everyone, "If I fight, I could lose the last good thing I found." Rosa moved closer, lowering her voice. "There's something else." She pulled another folded note from her coat. Carmen intercepted a message. "Tomorrow's meeting at Union Square. It's not just about transfers. Brian is negotiating with federal investigators. He's offering you as the sacrifice." Richard's stomach lurched. It wasn't just that Brian had framed him. It was that Brian had already handed his name over, a bargaining chip for immunity. If Richard showed up tomorrow, the agents wouldn't see a victim. They'd see a criminal already gift-wrapped by his own brother. The room closed in around him. Tyler's lips parted in shock. Marcus muttered a curse, pacing like a caged animal. Richard sank back against the wall, the note trembling in his hand. His brother hadn't just stolen his empire. He had poisoned his identity, turned him into the villain in everyone's eyes. For the first time, Richard wondered if there was any version of this fight he could win. If you were Richard, would you risk walking into Union Square knowing your brother has already painted you as guilty, or would you disappear forever and abandon the fight for justice? As the rain thickened outside and the boys waited for his answer, Richard realized that the greatest danger tomorrow wasn't losing to Brian. It was being buried alive under a lie that the world might never question. The city lights of Union Square blurred in the drizzle. As Richard stood in the shadow of the fountain, the leather bag clutched tight to his chest. Every instinct told him to run, to vanish into the anonymity of the crowd. But something stronger held him there. The sight of Tyler and Marcus watching from across the plaza. Two boys who had given him mercy when the world had given him none. Two boys who believed in him more fiercely than he had ever believed in himself. His pulse thundered. He knew Brian had already framed him, that federal eyes would see a villain, not a victim. Yet tonight was not just about survival. It was about truth, however poisoned, and about what kind of man he would choose to be in the end. Brian appeared, stepping from a sleek SUV as if the storm itself bowed to him. Immaculate in his tailored coat, flanked by men in dark suits, he moved with the arrogance of someone who thought he had already won. Their eyes locked across the plaza, two brothers bound by blood and betrayal. For a moment, memories threatened to break through. Childhood summers, Marina's laughter, the first days of Coleman Foods when hope had outweighed greed. But those ghosts were drowned in the weight of forged signatures and years of deceit. Richard felt the boy's presence at his back, and Rosa somewhere in the crowd, ready to pass the last fragments of evidence. He stepped forward, raising his voice against the hum of traffic and the toll of the church bell. "Brian!" The sound cut through the night. Heads turned. Brian's smirk flickered just slightly. Richard pulled the folder from the bag, raising it high enough for the federal agent stationed nearby to see. "This is the truth," he said, his voice breaking, "and if I fall with it." Gasps rippled as he threw the folder onto the wet pavement, pages scattering like wings under street lamps. Agents surged forward. Brian snapped to his men, shouting, but the crowd pressed closer, curious, recording with phones. Richard realized in that instant the twist Brian hadn't planned for. Truth was no longer confined to files or signatures. It was in the voices, the witnesses, the ordinary people watching. Tyler darted forward, his small hands gathering pages, shouting, "Look, he forged everything." The boy's voice cracked but carried, raw and undeniable. Marcus flanked him, daring anyone to silence them. Brian lunged, fury tearing his mask apart, but agents intercepted, dragging him back as he cursed Richard's name. One agent grabbed Richard too, binding his wrists, the weight of steel biting cold. He didn't resist. In his chest, something lighter than victory stirred. He had lost his empire, his freedom was uncertain, but he had not lost his humanity. For the first time in years, he felt like a man who had chosen truth over survival. Tyler's eyes filled with tears as they pulled Richard away. "You told the truth," the boy whispered, trembling but proud. Marcus's voice was harder, steady. They'll know one day. We'll make them. Richard nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He wanted to tell them they had given him something Brian could never steal, redemption. But the words stayed locked behind the lump in his chest. In the days that followed, headlines blared the scandal. Some called Richard corrupt, and others called him a fallen titan. Brian's name rotted in every column, yet Richard's own remained stained, tangled in the lie he could not untangle in time. But among the streets of Brooklyn, in a trailer park where two brothers once scavenged cans, a different story lived. Tyler and Marcus knew what had really happened. They carried it not as a burden, but as a flame. And Richard, sitting in a cell with rain dripping through the bars, felt a strange peace. He had not saved Coleman Foods. He had not even saved himself. But he had saved the part of him Marina once loved, the part that still chose decency when everything else was stripped away. The storm that had begun with betrayal ended with silence, but within that silence was a seed of hope. Perhaps history would forget him. Perhaps the world would never know the truth. But two boys did. And in the end, that was enough. What do you feel after experiencing Richard's journey of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption? Comment 100 if you enjoyed this story. Which country are you watching from? Share this video with your friends to spread it further. Thank you for watching on Hope Stories.